let's address the elephant in the room. Today we're in Judges 4, and the judge that we're speaking about is Deborah, a woman. And over the years, historians, theologians, they have tried to downplay Deborah. They have said things like, well, maybe, she was in a position of status because of her husband. No, scriptures don't support that. Actually, the translation could easily be that she was just a woman for a particular town. Doesn't necessarily mean a married woman. Others have said, hey, maybe she stepped up because men in that time didn't step up to do what they were called to do. That's speculation. Scriptures, again, don't say that. What I tend to believe is what scriptures clearly say, that God had prepared Deborah with gifts and skills that were needed for this particular time, for this particular moment in time. Here at Crossbridge, we believe that women are made in the image of God, just like men. That women have gifts, abilities, talents, that God has equipped them to do the work of the church. So we try to foster an environment that women could exercise their gifts. So today we'll talk about Deborah in a moment, but I want to give you a little bit of background. We're in the book of Judges. This is the fourth sermon that we're in this book, and I want to remind you that last week we looked at the first three judges, and now we're looking at this fourth judge, and what we have seen is that God has raised judges to deliver his people that time and time again decide to do what's evil in his sight. I want us to focus on three things this morning. First, we're going to look at the ruler, which is Deborah. We're going to look at her character, but we also have two other characters. We're going to look at Barak, who was the rescuer, and we'll look at him and what he did. And then we also look at another character, another woman, a surprising hero, that we'll call her the victorious. And we'll see how God is speaking to us today through these characters. So first, let's get into the first point, the ruler. Verse 1 says that the people again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. If you don't remember, last week we talked about how the people of God knew in their heads who God was and what God wanted them to do, but for some reason that didn't penetrate their hearts, so they would tend to forget. They would tend to forget because other things became more real to them than God himself. So they would turn back to doing what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. Today, we do the same thing. We talked about that last week. We live in America, and America is a very privileged nation. We have wealth, we have comforts in our country. There's no other nation in the history of the world, not just in the world today, that is as privileged as we are today in America. The wealth and the comfort of today sometimes becomes an idol. Sometimes we are so caught up in how we can make our life more comfortable that we forget about what God has called us to do, and we forget about God and all that he's done for us. So that's why we can relate to what's happening here, because this is exactly what happens to the people of God. They forget, and what does God does? Where God responds in a loving way. We see in verses 2 and 3, and the Lord sold them into the hands of the king of Canaan. And this king was a cruel, cruel man, according to what we read in scriptures, along with the leader of his army, Sisera. So God has to respond to this by allowing this to happen. Remember, we said that sometimes God allows certain things to happen to us because otherwise we don't turn back to God. Since we're so caught up in our comfort, sometimes God has to change our environment. Yeah, I mean, we do it all the time as parents, right? We send our kids, hey, go on time out. You need to think about what you've done. Or we take away the things that they might like, or we don't give them the things that we promised because they are misbehaving. I pray that God does the same thing for us today. Sometimes he might have to change our environment so we could turn back to him, because there's no other way sometimes. But God doesn't end there. He raises up a judge. We see in verse 4 that Deborah was raised up, and she was the prophetess. It says she was a prophetess. So I want us to learn 3 things from Deborah that we could apply to our lives today. Because Deborah was not just the ruler, but she was a leader of the people. She was a leader of the state of Israel. So if Israel was today the United States of Israel, Deborah will be our president, because she was leading the people. That's what we learned. So the first thing we learn is that Deborah was a prophetess. And what does that mean? Well, that means that Deborah had intimacy with the Lord. That means that Deborah was into her word, that Deborah was spending time in prayer, that Deborah had a relationship with God. Godly leaders need to have intimacy with God. We need to spend time with our God in prayer, reading his word. We need to have intimacy. That's the first characteristics that we see from Deborah. She had an intimacy with God. But we also see in verse 5 that she used to sit under the palms of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. So not only was she, in a great relationship with God, but she also was wise and had character to lead the people of Israel. See, Deborah, unlike any other judge that we read before, or that we will read in the next few sermons, Deborah was the only one that led the people outside of the battlefield. She was the only one that would lead the people during their daily lives. So she comes the closest to being a godly leader, because not only in the battlefield, but she also was ruling them with wisdom and character. She had certain things about her. She stepped up to lead. A leader steps up to lead, and she does that. We see that in chapter 5, verse 2. She also has compassion. We see that in chapter 5, verse 9. And these are all great qualities of a leader that we can learn. And I want to tell you today that God needs all of us to be leaders. God needs all of us to step into a leadership role like Deborah did. We have a tremendous lack of leadership today, not just in the church, but in our workplace, in our communities, in our country. We have a lack of leadership, and God is calling us to be a leader where we at. I don't know about you, but Deborah being the only woman to be in this kind of position, I am sure she probably had doubts. I'm sure she probably had insecurities. But guess what? Sometimes God is going to call you to lead and to step up, even when you don't feel adequate, even when you feel that you don't have the skills, even when you feel that you don't know what you're supposed to do or how to do it. God is going to need you to step up and put aside your insecurities, put aside your doubts, and lead, because God needs us to lead today. There are so many instances in life that we are called to lead. If you are a parent, you have such an amazing role in the life of your children. You are a leader in the life of your children. Look, kids look up to their parents like if we are looking up to God. Our kids want to just be just like us. Everything that we do, they know it. Everything that you say, they repeat it. So you have an opportunity to lead as a parent. If you're an employer, you have an opportunity to lead in your workplace. The people that are under you, you have the opportunity to pour into their lives, to treat them with dignity, with honor, with respect. In your neighborhood, you have the opportunity to lead. God is calling us to lead wherever we're at. And you might say to yourself, well, I'm not a parent. I am not an employer. I am not a leader in my neighborhood. Look, God is calling you to start by leading yourself. Lead yourself with the way that you carry yourself, the way that you behave, the way that you act. Because guess what? There's always people watching. There are always people watching. And guess, you know what's the first thing that they know about you? That you're a Christian. So God needs us to lead, to step up into the leadership role. Now, Deborah being a woman, she has certain instincts that God needed her for. See, women see things differently than men do. There are things that women see that we men would never see. Women have, amongst many things, they have one of those things called mother's instinct. Mother's instinct. Deborah was chosen by God because she had the mother instinct. In chapter 5, verse 7 says, the villagers ceased in Israel. They ceased to be until I arose. I, Deborah, arose as a mother in Israel. Mothers have this ability, and I don't know, I see my wife. She does it every single day with our children. She spends the whole day. She's able to love on our kids. She has patience. She knows their characters in and out. I spend 2 hours, and I'm going crazy. She spends days, and she knows how to love them. She knows how to foster an environment that they thrive in. She knows how to get them to do what she wants all the time. Women have this ability, and you might have the opportunity to do it with your kids, but even if you don't have your own kids, you have people under you that you are able to love in a motherly way. I know of women that they don't have their own children, but they love people. They have so many more children because they have this instinct. And Deborah was chosen for this very reason. Have you guys heard of Thomas Edison? Thomas Edison said that he came home one day from school with a paper, and he gave it to his mother, and he said, Mom, they gave me this letter. Can you read it? Can you tell me what it says? He was about 7 years old. His mom, teared up, read the letter, and said, this is what the letter says, son. Your son is a genius. This school is too small for him and doesn't have enough teachers to train him. Please teach him yourself. So, many years passed later. Obviously, he became an amazing inventor. And after his mother passed, he was going through some stuff of his mom, and he found this letter. And this letter said the following: your son is mentally deficient. We cannot let him attend our school anymore. He is expelled. You're going to have to teach him now. Thomas Edison started bawling, crying for hours at a time, and after he calmed down, he wrote this on his diary. He said, Thomas A. Edison was a mentally deficient child whose mother turned him into the genius of a century. These are some of the things that mothers only can do, that women only can do. And God had chosen Deborah, and he had chosen you, ladies, to be leaders where you're at. And we need you desperately. So that's Deborah. That's the first character of our passage. Let's continue, and we'll go right into point 2, because you see, a good leader like Deborah recognizes what her limitations are. She knew that she couldn't lead Israel. She couldn't lead the men into battlefield. She knew she needed a rescuer. And we see that in verses 6 and 7. She sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you? Go, gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun, and I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. So Deborah, being a wise leader, knowing that her limitations are what they are, summons Barak, calls Barak out, and says, I need you to lead God's people, because God is going to give us our enemy into our hand. So What can we learn from Barak? Well, we can learn quickly that he is obviously experienced in the battlefield. We can learn that he could lead because later in the passage, he leads. In verse 10, he leads 10,000 men. He needs 10,000 men, and he gets them. It's not an easy task to get 10,000 people to follow you. But what's interesting about Barak is the way that he responds to Deborah's calling. And look what he says. Verses 8 and 9 says, Barak said to her, if you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. So what do you say to that response? What do you think about that? A lot of theologians have said, well, this is a sign that he was missing some faith. He was showing a lack of faith. But as I was studying, I didn't quite understand that definition, because if we read Hebrews 11:32, they count Barak as one of the men of faith. They list them amongst the greatest men in the Bible of faith: Abraham, Jacob, Isaac, Moses. They list Barak because of his actions in this passage. So there has to be a better explanation. And a better translation of verse 9, which says, and she said to Barak, after he responds, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead you to glory. For the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. A better translation is that on the expedition that you will be taking, which kind of changes the tone of what we think of Barak. And this is what I think is the better understanding of Barak's response. Barak said, listen, I am going to go on this mission, but I'm not going to go without you because you are a prophetess. The Lord speaks to you. So if you go with me, if the Lord is with me, I know I will have victory. I know I will be successful. So I am not going to go if you do not go with me. And you know what we can learn? We can learn a great example from Barak about what it is to have faith. Faith is listening to God. Faith is listening to what God has to say. And we are privileged because we have his word with us. We can know what God says because we have his word. That's a first sign of having faith. When you know what God says in his word, you know what you ought to do and what you ought not to do. When you know what God says in his word, you know that if he is with you, you will have success. An example is that God asks us to love our neighbors. That is clearly in scriptures. We are given the opportunity every single day to show how we ought to love our neighbor. It is our decision to be kind. It is our decision to be loving. It is our decision to treat our neighbors how we would like to be treated ourselves. So God is calling us to act faithfully, to listen to his word. But we could also learn something else from Barak. We can learn that faith is showing courage. Listen, 10,000 men going against 900 chariots. It's not even close. The chariots will win every single time. 10,000 men will fall every single time. So Barak knew that he was going against a great opposition. He knew the numbers were stacked up against him. But you know what? He ended up going. He ended up acting in faith, and he ended up facing the enemy and not showing fear. And we see that God continuously asks us to act in courage. God needs us to stand up for what's right no matter what. There are going to be times in your lives, and I know some of us are probably going through it right now, that you have to say, you know what? I am not going to act in that certain way. I am not going to get into that kind of business. I am not going to say this on my taxes because this is not the way that I should behave. I should show courage. I should understand that God has my back, that God will see me through this. There's so many opportunities in today's world that we can stand for those that are in need of help, those that don't have a voice, those that are in difficult situations. And God is asking us to lead this way like Barak. And the last thing that we can learn from Barak is that faith does not seek honor. Faith is not honor seeking. So Barak was in an interesting position. Barak was said, hey, you have to go and face this army. You're not going to end up leading the people. I'm leading the people. That's Deborah's job. So he can't gain that by being successful here. And then Deborah prophesies that another person is going to get the recognition. So he's going to go on this battlefield and he's going to get not even the recognition. How many of us only do things when we are only going to get the recognition? We turn down opportunities after opportunities to lead, to do the right thing, because we're not going to get the credit. Well, Barak is an example of the fact that faith is humble. You do it not because you're trying to gain the recognition. You do it because it's the right thing to do. You do it because you know that at the end of the day, the only one that's ever recognized is God. So, we've seen Deborah, we've seen Barak. Now we are going to speak about one more character, someone that comes out of left field and takes the victory and defeats the enemy, Sisera, the leader of Jabin's army. In verse 11, we hear about this other person. It says, now Heber the Kenite has separated from the Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tent as far away as the oak of Sananim, which is near Kadesh. Now, let me give you a little bit of background of this character here, this person of Heber. The Kenites were the descendants of Moses' father-in-law. And they themselves came with the Israelites, crossed the 40 years in the desert. They came to the promised land. They even worship in Exodus 18:12 says that Moses' father-in-law worshiped the God of Israel. So they were amongst the people of Israel. They knew the God of Israel. But this descendant had decided to abandon the God of Israel just like the rest of God's people. And he says that he pinched his tent as far away from the people of God and as close as possible to the enemy, to the opposition. And it reminds me of the story of Lot. He did the same thing with Sodom and Gomorrah. He pinched his tent far, far away from Abraham and was so close to the enemy. You know, sometimes in our world, sometimes in our life, we do the same thing. We pinch our tent so far away from God that we are so close to the world that you can differentiate whether you are a Christian or not. Many times in our lives, we act like them. We act like non-Christians. We talk like them. We behave like them. Our practices are just like them. The way we conduct business, the way that we talk to our wives, the way we carry ourselves is just like the world does. James 4:4 says, "You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God." God needs us to be in the world, but he needs us to stand out. We are supposed to be set apart. That's what holiness means. We are set apart. So we are in the world. We love the world. We are going to preach to the world about the goodness of Christ, but we can't be like the world. We can't be pinching our tent so far away from God's purposes that we look just like the world. God is asking us to be set apart. So this man does this exact thing. And in verse 17, we see that he even made a treaty, an alliance with the enemy. Sometimes we make treaties and alliances with the world. And we join certain businesses and we act certain ways, and knowing that God wants something different from us. So then we meet Jael. She's the last character that we meet in this passage. We learn that the battle goes on, verses 12 through 16, and God comes and confuses Sisera's army. He does that through rain. We read that in the following chapter, because chapter 4 and chapter 5 are the same events. Chapter 5 is just saying it in a poetic way about what happened in chapter 4. So we learned that God confused the army. So the army was defeated. Sisera runs away, and we meet this last character. This is where the plot thickens, and we have no idea what's going to happen. But let's see what happens. And Jael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my lord. Turn aside to me. Do not be afraid." So he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. And he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. And he said to her, "Stand at the opening of the tent, and if a man comes and asks you, 'Is anyone here?' say no." But Jael, the wife of Heber, this is the wife of the person that had made the treaty with the Canaanites, took a tent peg, took a hammer in her hand. Then she went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple, a.k.a. his head, it went down into the ground while he was lying fast asleep from weariness. So he died. So, Jael, gangster. She was an ordinary woman doing what ordinary women did at this time, which was they used to set the tents. They were in charge of the tents and setting up the living area for their families. And God uses her. God decides that she's going to be a tool that he's going to use to defeat his enemy. We sometimes feel that we can't do what God has called us to do because we are ordinary people. You know, I'm not a preacher, pastor. I don't get in front of stages. I barely can even speak in public. Or, you know, I don't have the kind of position or status to lead or to do these kinds of things. But I'm going to tell you that God needs you where you're at. He uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things all the time. This is the consistency of Scripture. So God could use you where you're at if you allow him to. And that's the first thing we learn from this character, Jael. She was an ordinary person, but God could use ordinary people to do extraordinary things. She also took a stand. Before she took a stand, let me point number 2 is that she used the tools that were at her disposal. So sometimes we think that we don't have what it takes. We don't have the tools. We don't have the abilities. But God allows you to be a leader where you're at, because whatever is at your disposal, whatever it is, whether it's your neighbor, whether it's your children, whether it's your coworkers, you have the tools at your disposal to lead and to make an impact. But she also took a stand. She took a stand that was opposite from her husband. Now, I don't want you guys to raise your hand, but how many times you women have to stand, wives, against maybe something that your husband has said? It happens in my house quite often. And you have to, in a loving way, guide your husbands the other way. She was brave. She did this. She did the exact thing. Her husband had made an alliance with the Canaanites, but she took a stand, because sometimes we have to make a stand. Take a stand for God, even if it's in opposition to the people that we love, even if it's opposition to what's known, even if it's in opposition to the common thought, even if it's not the standard of what we know, we have to take a stand. If it's for God, God will back us up. Sometimes we have to take the stand, and she did just that. Now, why was this scene so graphic? I mean, God allowed this woman to do this horrific thing. Why? It's a little confusing why this scene had to be so graphic, why we had to have the whole head smashing scene in the book of the Bible. It is interesting, if you read chapter 5, it says what Sisera used to do after he won the different battles. And this is what it says. Out of the window, this is verse 28, chapter 5. Out of the window she peered. The mother of Sisera wailed through the lattice. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarry the hoofbeats of his chariots? And get this is where it gets interesting. Her wisest princess answered, indeed, answers herself. She answered herself. Have they not found and divided the spoil? A womb or two for every man. Spoil of dyed materials for Sisera. Spoil of dyed materials embroidered. 2 pieces of dyed work embroidered for the neck are spoiled. If you didn't get it, when he says a womb or two for every man, what he's saying, what the passage is saying, is that this man used to capture women, kidnap them, rape them, and divide it amongst his soldiers. That's what they would do every time they would go out on battle, and they would defeat their enemies. Sisera was an evil and cruel man. The poetic justice that God did here is that this evil and cruel man that is used to kidnapping girls and women and raping them and killing them comes to the defeat in the hands of a woman. You reap what you sow. We learned that in the scriptures. This man died in the hand of a woman, and it was considered one of the most humiliating things that could happen. And Deborah's prophecy comes true. So, what can we learn? In conclusion, humanly speaking, we could say that there are 3 victors, 3 people that we could give the credit for being the hero of this story. But in reality, we know, and the consistent theme of the Bible and the consistent theme of Judges is that God is the real hero. God is always the hero. In chapter 5, we see it throughout the whole chapter that the credit, Deborah writes this poem, and the credit consistently goes to God. God is the rescuer. He's the real rescuer. God is the one that wins, and when we're in the side of God, we win ourselves. We need to have a perspective on life like chapter 5 has on this story, which is that God is always the one that we should give credit for all the good things that happen in our lives, for all the blessings that we see, for all the success that we see. God is really the one that's doing all these things. And we see that Judges continuously, time and time again, points us to Jesus. Why? Because Jesus is the better and greater Deborah. Isaiah 9:6 says, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. So Jesus is the better and greater Deborah because he is the true ruler. He is the true ruler from God that came to bring the peaceful rule upon our lives. He's also the better and greater Barak. He reminds us that Christ is the great deliverer. We see that in Philippians 2:6. Who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So Jesus is the better and greater Barak. He was obedient. He came, and knowing that he was going to face death and he was going to die, he still was obedient to the point of death. And finally, Jesus is the better and greater Jael, who crushes our enemies, sin and death, once and for all, through his death, burial, and resurrection. Isaiah 15:55 says, O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. And that's the good news of the gospel, that Jesus is the truer and better judge, and we could always count on him to step up and to lead us even when we fail at it. Even when we don't do a good job of it, he never fails. He's always consistent. He's always there for us. And he is our true deliverer. Let's pray. Father God, thank you for Jesus. Thank you for the work on the cross. Thank you because we read in your word that Judges continuously, time and time again, points us to your Son, points us to the work that Jesus did on our behalf on the cross, points us to the fact that he crushed our enemy's head, sin and death, and he defeated our enemy on our behalf. Thank you for him. Thank you because he already did the work for us. Thank you because we don't need to do anything besides to trust in him. The work is done. We are simply reaping the benefits of what Jesus did. We don't deserve it. We didn't do nothing to earn it. But here we are. We come into your family. We reap the rewards of him to be in relationship with you. So we thank you for that. We thank you that time and time again you show us through your scriptures that we can never do enough, that you have done it all for us. So today, as we come to your table, may we meditate, may we think and remember that you have done the work and that you have a plan for us, for all of us in your kingdom, and to do the work that you've called us to. I thank you in Jesus' name.